On a seemingly ordinary Monday morning, Washington was rocked by news that no one had seen coming. The city, usually abuzz with routine political maneuvering, was suddenly thrown into chaos as headlines flashed across every screen and officials scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Canada had just signed a sweeping, unprecedented bilateral agreement with China, one that would send shockwaves through the corridors of power not only in Washington, but around the world. This wasn't just another routine trade deal, it was a bold move targeting two of the most critical sectors of the modern global economy: oil and electric vehicles. The agreement promised to reshape the flow of energy and technology across continents with far-reaching consequences. For years, the United States had operated under the assumption that North America would always act as a united front, especially when it came to countering China's growing economic influence. That illusion was shattered in an instant, leaving American policymakers reeling. The White House was completely caught off guard. Senior officials rushed into emergency meetings trying to piece together how Canada, one of America's closest allies, had managed such a dramatic pivot without any warning. The agreement gave China preferential access to Canadian oil, a resource long considered a North American asset. At the same time, it opened Canadian markets to a flood of affordable Chinese electric vehicles, all while bypassing the United States entirely. American leaders felt blindsided and betrayed. The deal was more than just a diplomatic surprise, it was a direct challenge to U.S. dominance in both the energy sector and the rapidly growing green economy. The announcement signaled a deep crack in the Western alliance, exposing the unintended consequences of years of U.S. tariffs and tough policies on China. Instead of isolating Beijing, those measures had inadvertently pushed a key ally straight into China's embrace. Trade routes began to shift almost overnight, with Canadian and Chinese business leaders celebrating new opportunities. The United States, once the center of North American trade, now found itself increasingly isolated as its two neighbors drew closer together. Canada was making a bold statement to the world. Its economic interests would no longer be dictated by Washington. The message was clear: Ottawa was ready to chart its own course, even if it meant breaking with tradition. The U.S. auto industry, already struggling to compete with the influx of Chinese electric vehicles, now faced a new and immediate threat right on its doorstep. American workers and executives alike watched with growing anxiety as their market share slipped away. American energy producers, who had long relied on a stable North American market, suddenly saw their future thrown into uncertainty. Stock markets reacted swiftly, with energy sector shares taking a sharp hit as investors tried to gauge the fallout. This wasn't just another headline or a fleeting news cycle. It marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power, not just in North America, but across the global stage. The world was watching, and the stakes had never been higher. Washington now had to face a sobering new reality. Its leadership, even in its own backyard, was no longer guaranteed. The era of unquestioned American dominance in North America had come to an abrupt and unexpected end. Canada's dramatic pivot on electric vehicle tariffs was fueled by mounting frustration with its own 100% surtax on Chinese EVs, a policy originally meant to align closely with the United States and protect North American interests. The government believed this tough stance would strengthen its relationship with its southern neighbor and bolster its own auto industry. However, critics quickly argued that these steep tariffs were undermining Canada's ambitious climate goals, making affordable electric vehicles unattainable for most Canadian families. The dream of a green transition seemed to be slipping further away as the price of EVs soared and demand plummeted. The government found itself caught in a difficult dilemma. Should it protect its fledgling domestic EV industry and maintain its crucial alliance with the US, or should it prioritize accelerating the green transition and making EVs accessible to all Canadians? The situation worsened when China retaliated with tariffs on Canadian exports, making the policy even more painful for Canadian businesses and workers who relied on international trade. The debate split experts and the public alike. Some insisted on shielding Canadian industry from foreign competition, while others called for more flexibility to secure both economic prosperity and environmental progress. The nation was at a crossroads with no easy answers. As economic pain mounted and progress on domestic EV production remained slow, the government was forced to confront the harsh reality that its current path was unsustainable. Factories sat idle, jobs were at risk, and public frustration grew. Eventually, the government realized that unwavering loyalty to U.S. trade policy was coming at too high a cost for Canadian workers, families, and the nation's future. Breaking ranks with Washington and opening negotiations with China became a calculated risk, a bold move to regain control over Canada's economic destiny and restore hope for a greener, more prosperous future. This decision signaled a new willingness to put national interests first, even if it meant challenging old alliances and forging new partnerships. The move set the stage for a historic agreement that stunned Washington and sent shockwaves through the global auto industry, marking a turning point in Canada's approach to trade and climate policy. For the first time in years, Canada was no longer willing to sacrifice its future for the sake of continental unity. Instead, it chose a path that promised both economic resilience and environmental leadership. Aligning with U.S. tariffs had already hurt Canada deeply. Factories that once bustled with activity now stood silent, and warehouses sat empty, their doors shuttered. The ripple effects of these decisions were felt in every corner of the country, from the border crossings where trucks slowed to a crawl, to the small towns that depended on trade for survival. China's counter-tariffs targeted vulnerable sectors. Canola farmers and fisheries suffered as exports to China collapsed. Fields of canola, once golden with promise, now faced uncertain futures, while fishing boats remained tied up at the docks, their crews out of work and communities struggling to adapt. A policy meant to protect auto jobs in central Canada ended up punishing the prairies and coasts. While Ontario's auto factories received government support, grain silos in the prairies emptied and rural economies faltered, revealing the unintended consequences of a one-size-fits-all approach. Resentment grew as regions felt sacrifice for Ontario and Quebec's benefit, deepening national divides. Protests erupted in cities and rural towns alike, with citizens voicing frustration over policies that seemed to favor some at the expense of others, fueling a sense of alienation and mistrust. The crisis exposed the fragility of a strategy that pitted region against region. Headlines declared a growing regional crisis, and the torn fabric of the nation became a symbol of the high price of political loyalty. Canada's EV plan, reliant on protectionism, was failing to deliver affordable cars or meet climate targets. Despite ambitious promises, electric vehicles remained out of reach for many Canadians, and climate activists grew impatient with the lack of real progress. Critics argued that blocking competition wasn't a path to a world-class green economy. They pointed to innovation abroad, especially in places like China, where open markets fueled rapid advancements, and warned that Canada risked falling behind. Canada couldn't produce enough affordable EVs to meet demand. Dealerships struggled to keep cars in stock, charging stations saw long lines, and consumers faced sticker shock, all while the dream of a green transition seemed to slip further away. The tariffs became a self-imposed barrier, not a shield. Instead of protecting Canadian jobs, they slowed trade, increased costs, and isolated the country from global supply chains. The fallout forced a hard look at whether loyalty to U.S. policy was worth the cost. Policymakers debated the future, weighing the value of alliances against the needs of their own citizens, and questioning if following the U.S. lead truly served Canada's best interests. The answer was increasingly clear: it wasn't. Across the nation, disappointment and frustration grew, as Canadians realized that the price of loyalty had become too high to bear. As economic pain spread, calls for a policy overhaul grew louder. Industry, economists, and environmentalists agreed. Affordable EVs were essential for Canada's climate goals. Chinese EVs, far cheaper than North American models, offered the fastest route to mass adoption. Experts proposed targeted or temporary tariffs to protect vulnerable sectors while opening the market. The debate became a test of Canada's independence: follow the US or chart its own course. The government recognized the status quo was unsustainable. Internal pressure drove Canada to the negotiating table with China. The resulting deal was a direct response to a crisis at home, and a pivot toward a pragmatic, self-directed strategy. What began as a bid to end a trade dispute became a chance to reshape Canada's future. Talks with China opened the door to economic diversification and less reliance on the US. Attracting Chinese investment in green tech, especially EV batteries, could jumpstart Canada's domestic supply chain and create thousands of jobs. The deal also secured Chinese demand for Canadian oil, appealing to Western provinces eager to diversify beyond the US by linking oil exports to green tech cooperation. The agreement bridged Canada's resource economy and climate ambitions. Critics warned of geopolitical risks, but supporters saw engagement as economic survival. The real threat, they argued, was over-reliance on a single volatile partner. Pragmatic negotiations positioned Canada as an independent player in the global green transition. Deeper ties with China, especially with EV giant BYD, posed a dilemma for Canada. Chinese investment promised affordable EVs and new jobs, but threatened to overwhelm fledgling Canadian manufacturers. Policymakers had to balance foreign investment with protecting domestic industry. Experts warned that simply opening the market wouldn't solve deeper issues. The agreement included conditions, joint ventures, local sourcing, and targeted investment in areas like battery minerals. These measures aim to ensure technology transfer and build a resilient Canadian industry. The goal leveraged foreign capital without becoming a satellite market. Canada sought to turn partnership into long-term strength, not dependency. The deal's economic promise was shadowed by security and ethical concerns. Chinese EVs packed with sensors and data systems raised fears of surveillance and data access by Beijing. US allies warned that integrating Chinese tech into critical infrastructure was risky. Control over vehicle data and compliance with China's security laws unsettled policymakers. Ethical issues also loomed. Battery materials linked to forced labor and human rights abuses. Canada insisted on third-party audits and supply chain transparency in the agreement. These steps aimed to build trust, but critics remained wary. The government faced a tough balancing act: economic gain versus security and values. At the heart of the deal was BYD, China's EV powerhouse. BYD's affordable cars could make EV ownership possible for many Canadians, but Ottawa hesitated to open the market fully. Protecting domestic auto jobs and avoiding a clash with US policy were key concerns. BYD already sold electric buses in Canada, but plans for a passenger car plant stalled amid trade tensions. The final agreement phased in BYD's entry, tying it to investment in Canadian battery production and R&D. This compromise aimed to capture BYD's benefits while giving local industry time to adapt. The BYD issue became a microcosm of the deal balancing consumer gains, industrial protection, and geopolitics. Canada's approach reflected a careful, strategic recalibration in a changing world. The China-Canada Oil and EV Pact has redrawn North America's economic and political map. It's more than a trade deal, it's a seismic shift challenging decades of US dominance. The US must now confront the limits of its influence as allies pursue their own interests. Chinese EVs could soon flood the Canadian market, pressuring US automakers. Canadian oil flowing to China reorients energy trade, reducing US leverage. America faces a choice: double down on protectionism, or adopt a more collaborative, competitive approach. Rebuilding trust may require new incentives and joint ventures in green tech. The future of North American trade hinges on Washington's next move. The chessboard has been reset, and the world is watching.